Hello everyone, this is Mark Lane. Today we're going to do Lecture 5, which is on the Enlightenment and the Scientific Revolution. Now, in order to start this lecture, we sort of need to recap what we talked about last time. And if you remember what we talked about last time, that was sort of our end of unit lecture, end of Unit 1. We talked about the development of the nation state as the culmination of three processes, three changes that were necessary in Europe. The first change was a demographic change, and we saw that all the way in the very first lecture, where new high-calorie food coming in from the New World leads to the growth of cities and starts fueling the rise of European society in its section of the world. The second is the political change. You needed the political changes of the Reformation to come along to change the Pope's role in political life and guarantee a state's, a country's political autonomy. And lastly, you needed these economic changes because you needed the rise of mercantilism to show that there was such a thing as not only a national economy, but a national interest in that economy that was not necessarily the same as the interests of the ruler, but that there was this idea of a national interest that was good for the country. And as a result of this, you start seeing a divergence between monarchies and states that just happen to be ruled by kings. Before the nation state, monarchies were generally run in the feudal model of production that we saw in Lecture 2. And in this case, the state really exists to serve the ruler because the ruler is in charge because God says so. We call this the divine right of kings. I am the king because I have been ordained by God, and the entire land exists to serve me. In a state model that just happens to have a king, you have a more mercantilist, more modern model of production. And in this case, the ruler is just a glorified bureaucrat. He or she exists to serve the state, not the other way around. You know, I bring this example up all the time, but if you turn on Netflix and you watch the show The Crown's all about the life of Queen Elizabeth II of England. And what you'll notice about her life is that a lot of things that she's had to do over the course of her life have really been forced, quote, for good of country. There are a lot of choices that she makes that she would not have made if she were looking out for her own interests. And this is sort of what we talk about when we talk about the ruler as existing to serve the state. And more importantly, that ruler has power, as we saw in the Hobbesian model, because of the social contract. A contract between the governed and the governors that allow the ruler to have power. And that contract can be revoked if the ruler is not holding up their end of the bargain, as we see in the English Civil War. Now that that's clear, I'd like to move on to the scientific revolution. Because what the scientific revolution is simply put, a rediscovery of old knowledge that happens almost as a result of the Protestant Reformation and mercantilism. And the reason for this is very simple. If you remember back to the Protestant Reformation lecture, we said that one of the key drivers of the Protestant Reformation is the invention of the printing press. And the first book ever published on that printing press is a Bible, printed in German, not Latin. And that's profoundly revolutionary because now you have democratized religious knowledge. Now, most everyone can read that Bible. But that's not the only book published, right? They don't just only push out Bibles and call it a day. In fact, there are lots and lots and lots of books that follow, especially after the Protestant Reformation. And there's a very simple reason for that. That is, the rise of what we're going to call surplus wealth, right? And so the way this works is very simple. You know, as we talked about as a result of the Columbian Exchange, as food production increased, this freed up a whole segment of society to move into what we call wealth-producing work, right? They move from fields into cities, and in those cities, they become workers, they become tradesmen, they produce wealth for society. But this is only possible because there is enough food, agricultural food in the system that allows them to do so. And much in the same way, the rise of mercantilism, of national economies, means that there's enough surplus wealth in the system to free up people to move into other pursuits. Because there's enough money in the economy that allows people to move into jobs and industries that maybe were not necessarily wealth producing. So artistic movements, and as we're going to see, scientific movements. And we talked about the printing press. And as we noted, the printing press, may also produce the Bible, but also produces all other forms of knowledge, right? It's not just the Bible that gets produced. Now the question I want to ask here is, where did all this knowledge come from, right? It's the rediscovery of old knowledge, but how do we have it? Let me phrase this question in a different way. I'm sure many of you have taken other courses in social sciences, like philosophy or other history classes. So how do we know all of these things about people like Aristotle or Plato? How do we have copies of what Julius Caesar tells us about his campaigns in Gaul? We don't have the internet in the 1600s. How do we know all of this? Well, turns out monasteries had as their primary purpose the preservation of knowledge. You had groups of monks whose whole job it was to copy and recopy and transcribe and retranscribe books of old knowledge that otherwise would have disintegrated and been lost to history. But of course, after the Protestant Reformation, and these monasteries are dissolved, all of this knowledge is just there. It's a free-for-all. And so the scientific revolution isn't necessarily the discovery of new things. It's fundamentally the rediscovery of old knowledge. Primary amongst these is the rediscovery of logic, or the science of making a good argument. And this dates back to Aristotle. Now, I know what you're thinking. This doesn't mean necessarily that people in the Middle Ages weren't logical, but logic as something that you can study, as something that is analytical and scientific, that's the quote-unquote new thing that comes out of Aristotle. And these individuals combine logic with observation of the natural world to come up with the scientific method. And you sort of get the sense in Isaac Newton's preface. Our design, not respecting arts but philosophy, and our subject, not manual but the natural powers, we consider chiefly those things which relate to gravity, levity, elastic force, the resistance of fluids and the like forces, whether attractive or impulsive, and therefore we offer this work as the mathematical principles of philosophy. And it's really important because you also get a sense of how these people view themselves. These people don't view themselves necessarily as scientists. We call them scientists. They refer to themselves as natural philosophers, the inheritors of a legacy that goes back to Plato and Socrates. And so they have a very large opinion of themselves. Now, as we said, the scientific method is just simply put observation plus logic applied to it. And you got a scientific method. What this is very, very good at is creating arguments that are fundamentally bulletproof. Arguments that are logically sound and that cannot be easily disproven. Which presents a real problem for the church when these scientifically proven arguments start disproving things that exist in Scripture. Galileo himself says, I can readily imagine Holy Father, that as soon as some people hear that in this volume I have written about the revolutions of the spheres of the universe, and I ascribe certain motions to the terrestrial globe, they will shout that I must be immediately repudiated together with this belief, for I am not so enamored of my own opinions that I disregard what others may think of them. Galileo in this passage acknowledges that the things that he has proven go against the traditional viewpoint of the church. And yet, when Galileo is being exiled and his works removed from society, he is said to have exclaimed in Italian, "Eppur si muove," and yet it moves. You can repudiate me, you can, do whatever you want with me, I will still be right. The planets will still move in the way that I say. And that's the power of the scientific method. Now, I do want to take a minute to play devil's advocate here and say, in defense of the church was just getting out of the 30 Years' War, the bloodiest war Europe had seen in a long time. And it was largely fought over scripture and doctrinal error. And they're just getting out of fighting this war. And now here come a bunch of scientists disproving scripture. I'm not saying this to justify their behavior. I think their behavior was atrocious, frankly. But that should give you a sense of politically why the church has one of the largest overreactions to science in history. They do it because the alternative is a return, in their mind at least, a return to a war that no one could afford right now. Now, the scientific revolution is profound in its scientific discovery, but it's also profound in that it sets up the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment is really where you see these principles take off. And the way I usually describe the Enlightenment is, simply put, where the scientific revolution was the use of scientific reasoning, study, and logic to apply to the natural world, from which you get math, astronomy, and biology. The Enlightenment is the application of those same principles in the study of society, from which you get the study of politics, man, and economics. So things like history studied analytically, political science, economics, all of this stuff comes out of the Enlightenment. The only reason we have social sciences in the first place is because the Enlightenment allowed them to happen. Now, in particular, I would like to focus on one Enlightenment thinker in particular. And that Enlightenment thinker is Adam Smith. And Adam Smith is born in the 18th century in Scotland. He's a professor of philosophy at the University of Glasgow. And he writes two big books: The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which is not what we're going to look at today, and The Wealth of Nations. And in The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith truly discusses his view on economics. And he uses a logical, studied way to figure out how the economy truly works. And what we'll end up finding is that the outcomes that he comes up with aren't necessarily those that have been dictated for the past 100 years by mercantilism. He defines the political economy as having two really distinct goals. The first, to provide a plentiful revenue or subsistence for the people, or more properly, to enable them to provide such revenue or subsistence for themselves. And secondly, to supply the state with revenue sufficient for the public services. It proposes to enrich both the people and the sovereign. Essentially what he's saying is that a good political economy, a well-run economy, makes both the ruler and the ruled wealthier. And in a good political economy, Adam Smith observes two productive forces that truly change the way we view society. The first is the division of labor. He says the greatest improvement in the productive powers of labor, and the greater part of the skill, dexterity, and judgment with which it is directed or applied seems to have been effects of the division of labor. Now, what is the division of labor? And the way I usually define it is quite simply, you're listening to my lecture right now, and you're taking this class with me right now. Why are you doing that? Now, you tell me, well, because you need the credits. You need the credits to get your degree. But why? Now, I'm sure you like to tell yourself, well, because education is important and because, getting a degree is a nice thing. But that's not why you're here. You're here listening to my lecture because you're looking to specialize. And you're looking to specialize for a very simple reason. Future revenue. Because it's going to get you paid, right? You study things like accounting, not because accounting is fun. My apologies to anyone studying accounting here. You study accounting because accounting has a very large starting salary, right? You specialize, and that's good for society. The division of labor makes every worker more specialized and more productive. It makes the economy more efficient because people are going to specialize in things that they're good at, or they're at the very least what society has deemed valuable, and it ends up saving costs for everyone. Everyone becomes better off when there are highly specialized accountants, highly specialized professors, highly specialized economists or mathematicians or dentists, right? Everyone benefits when people are specialized. I give this example to my students all the time. A friend of mine who I went to grad school with has one of the most oddly specific jobs that I can think of. My friend is a space lawyer. That's a thing. And the way I describe it is, two satellites collide in space. Who pays? Whose insurance pays? Right? And that's such an oddly specific position. There are only about a dozen of them in the world right now. A dozen space lawyers in the world right now. And they make a lot of money because in order to get that specialized, you need to have degrees in astrophysics, cybersecurity, law, and international relations. And my friend has all of those degrees. It takes a lot of specialization, but the specialization is ultimately a good thing because you have oddly specialized lawyers who are very, very good in their field and are paid accordingly. That's all good for society. He says it is the greatest multiplication of the products of all the different arts in consequence of the division of labor, which occasions in a well-governed society that universal opulence, that universal wealth that extends itself to the lowest ranks of the people. Everyone is better off when you have a division of labor. And this isn't because, again, we specialize because that's good for society. This is Gordon Gekko, famous in the movie Wall Street, who has one big line. Greed is good. Well, for Adam Smith, he says, well, greed may not be good, but amongst men, the most dissimilar geniuses are of those of use to one another. The different produces of their respective talents, by the general disposition to truck, barter, and exchange, being brought, as it were, into a common stock, where every man may purchase whatever part of the produce of other man's talents he has the occasion for. Essentially, the division of labor has allowed us to produce what we're good at, not because we're nice, but because we're greedy. And greed may not be good, but it is definitely natural. Adam Smith sort of does the same ideological construct that Hobbes did way back when. And he looks at a state of nature. But unlike Hobbes, where Hobbes says we would fight all the time over the things that we want because our wants are infinite and resources are finite, and without any rules to keep us from fighting, we would just fight all the time. Adam Smith says, well, that's not necessarily true. We wouldn't fight over the things we want, but we would try to trade instead. But that's not because we're nice people, it's because we're greedy, and that's okay. He says, more succinctly, It's not from the benevolence of the butcher or the brewer or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love. And we never talk to them of our own necessities, but of their own advantages. Let me put this in a more practical case. Maybe you're eating right now as you're watching this video. Maybe you went to the bagel shop down the road and bought yourself a bagel. When you walk into the bagel shop down the road and buy yourself a bagel, you don't go up to the guy and say, "Oh my God, I'm really hungry. Please, can I get some bagels and get on my way?" No. They'll laugh at you. You pay them. You address their own self-love. Their self-love being their profit. But this is okay, because we can't get everything we want by ourselves. And so we rely on other people to get what we need. All of us act out of self-interest to get what we want. And this is why we specialize. And this promotes a higher standing of living for everyone. Now, the other big idea that Adam Smith brings to the table is the idea of the invisible hand. As he says, each individual neither intends to promote the public interest, nor knows how much he is promoting it. He intends only his own gain, and he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. Nor is it always worse for society that it was no part of it. Essentially, what Adam Smith says, when each of us act in our own greedy, self-interested way, we may not think that we're doing good by society, but in reality, we are. Because when everyone acts in their own self-interest, that always leads to the optimal, most efficient and balanced outcome for society. Because when we all act in our own self-interest, that collectively leads to the best outcome. We specialize and divide labor out of self-interest, not common goals, but that actually leads to a better societal outcome than any government policy. Our shared greed guides us like an invisible hand. Adam Smith says, by pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of society more effectively than when he really intends to promote it. I have never known much good done by those who affected to trade for the public good. Be greedy, be selfish. Adam Smith says that's okay. And in terms of things the government can do, nothing at all. Stay out of it. Stay out of the economy. Let people make their greedy, self-interested decisions on their own, without interference. And you'll find that society will come to the largely mutually beneficial outcome. And this is a strong repudiation of mercantilism, because if you remember, in mercantilism, the government was supposed to get involved as much as possible in order to maximize profit. Not so in Adam Smith liberalism. Adam Smith says the best thing the government can do is to just get out of it. Now, I'm going to give you a case study here. And I give you this case study because, well, we can see this over the course of our lifetime. It's fresh and it's recent. So this here is the original iPhone. The original iPhone in the market of smartphones was expensive, didn't have any apps. The apps come later. Had a small screen, a short battery life, and it was very slow. Now this came out 10 years ago. 10 years later, you can buy a smartphone that is cheaper, smarter, faster, better, and with a larger display for $25. That's a true price. I found that on Walmart.com, not a sponsor. $25 for a phone that in 10 years is exponentially better. But this isn't because the government stepped in and said, all right, Apple, you have to make cheaper, better, faster smartphones for everyone. No. What ended up happening? Well, the iPhone wasn't the only smartphone on the block for long. Soon you had Android phones. Soon you had Windows phones and BlackBerry phones and WebOS Palm phones. You guys remember those? You had all sorts of smartphones. And this created competition. Competition forced Apple to improve its product, not out of desire, but out of necessity, out of a need to stay competitive for their own survival, which in turn led to other smartphones being better for their own survival. And smartphones that were not better died out. There's a reason why nobody carries a BlackBerry anymore. BlackBerry did not innovate, and as such is almost dead. But I'll give you an even more practical example. If you guys remember, Apple phones for the longest time were very small. They weren't large phones until Samsung made their gigantic phones, and now suddenly Apple has a large phone, and because people complained that the large phone was too large, now they have a large phone, a medium phone, and a small phone. Right? And this is a good thing. I'm not saying this to make fun of Apple. Quite the opposite. I'm saying this is exactly what Adam Smith would say is a good thing. Right? It leads to, simply put, competition leads to bigger, better, faster, cheaper smartphones for everyone. Smartphones are getting cheaper all around the world. It may not seem so in the world of $1,000 iPhone 10s, but by and large, smartphones are getting cheaper and better and faster every year. And that's not because the government got involved. That's because of competition and the invisible hand leading to bigger, better, cheaper smartphones for everyone. So if you need to remember Adam Smith, remember that rule. And it will allow you to remember the precepts of Adam Smith style liberalism more clearly. So I hope this made sense. If you have any questions, email me or leave them in the comment section down below, and I'll see you in the next lecture. Bye.